Good evening and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm Stephen Seawer. I chair the club's LGBT member forum, and I'll be your moderator for tonight's program. We also welcome our listening audience, and we invite everyone to visit us at commonwealthclub.org. Our speaker this evening is journalist and author Mike Weiss. In 1978 and 1979, Mike did extensive reporting on the assassinations of Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk while working for Rolling Stone and Time magazine. Tonight, Mike is here to discuss his award-winning book, Double Play: The Hidden Passions Behind the Double Assassination of George Moscone and Harvey Milk. Double Play stands as an essential source about a time in the city's history that is iconic, formative, and devastating. Double Play provides an intimate look into the lives of three men who came to City Hall from divergent paths. Mike details the rise to power, how City Hall impacted them, and the events leading up to the tragic assassinations. Mike's research is astounding, and his perceptions are poignant with great compassion for the shocking events of the day. Mike Weiss was an award-winning reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle and is a recipient of the Edgar Award from the Mystery Writers of America for his narrative account of the assassinations. Please welcome Mike Weiss. Do a little two-step here.
Yes. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to the members of the club for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. And I want to assure you that I'm going to let everybody get out of here before dark, which is not much of a promise on the longest day of the year. What I'm going to do tonight is simply recreate the assassinations and the trial that followed and the events that followed that, leading through the time of Dan White's suicide. And try to answer some of the questions that I know still trouble people who think about this sad event in the city's history. I'd like to bend that down a little. When Dan White went down to City Hall to assassinate Mayor George Moscone and his fellow supervisor, Harvey Milk, he definitely had a plan. He was very methodical in its preparation and its execution. He oiled his gun. He filled the gun with 5 cartridges and then took 10 extra cartridges out of their styrofoam slots, which involved pulling each one out individually. You couldn't just dump them and wrap them in a handkerchief and put them in his pocket. He shaved, he showered, he put on a suit and tie. He told the aide who came to pick him up, Denise Abkar, on his way to City Hall, that he planned to give George and Harvey a piece of his mind. He borrowed Denise's car keys, so there was a getaway vehicle ready. He entered the City Hall through the Polk Street steps, saw that the policeman on the metal detector was not known to him. He knew a lot of cops. He had been a cop himself, and of course, he was now a city supervisor. So he reversed course, went outside, found a window on the side of the building, climbed through the window, went up a back staircase, hesitated again at the door to the mayor's office because he knew on the other side of that door was the mayor's security detail, waited for a clerk to come along, the door was open, he snuck in the back door. He killed George Moscone by emptying his former service revolver into him. The last 2 shots, he straddled Moscone's fallen body and put the shots into the back of his head. Then he did something very similar, crossed City Hall, reloaded, crossed City Hall, assassinated Harvey in just exactly the same way. And he even provided a kind of explanation for what had happened. He had ripped off and put into his jacket pocket the cover, or the flyleaf of a book by Leon Uris called Ireland, a Terrible Beauty. And when he turned himself in at Northern Station and he was asked if he had anything to say, he simply handed over that piece of paper that he was carrying in his pocket as an explanation. Am I talking loud enough to be heard? Good. At his trial, several months after these carefully planned and executed events, he was convicted not of premeditated murder, but of the lesser crime of voluntary manslaughter. Dan White would serve only about 6 years in state prison. That night, the night of his verdict, City Hall came under attack. In my entire life, I don't think I've ever seen anything that gave me more shivers than what happened at City Hall on the night of the Dan White verdict. Hundreds and hundreds of people, many thousands came, but hundreds and hundreds feeling exposed and vulnerable and frightened and furious, literally attacked the seat of government. They knocked down pieces of stone and metal, they smashed the windows, and they set afire 9 police cars, so that the whole scene took on a phantasmagoric aspect. You had the light of the burning cars and their sirens bleating and the crowd chanting and cops and protesters fighting each other literally in the street. It wasn't a riot, it was a fight. At any rate, I had been there for every day of the trial, and I was there again in Civic Center that night. And after the trial, I felt very, very strongly that the trial itself had failed to provide satisfactory answers to most of the questions that San Franciscans had about those terrible events. The trial, in the end, didn't tell you a great deal about why Dan White assassinated Harvey Milk, his fellow office holder. It certainly didn't get into any question of whether Harvey was killed because he was gay. A question, I think, still lingers in many people's minds. Was this what we would nowadays call a hate crime? And we also wondered, I think, at the time, how Dan White got away with what so clearly seemed to be a cold-blooded murder. As we will see, he eventually confessed to his having a plan on that day, but that was many years later after justice or injustice had been done. So it was to answer those questions that I undertook to write the book. George Moscone was a native San Franciscan. He had served in the state senate where he had rose to a leadership position. He was a little bit of what we would call in later years a prince of the city. He drove an Alfa Romeo. He closed many a joint throughout the town. As his good friend Willie Brown said about George, he said, you know, George's only problem is that when he's had 2 drinks, he thinks he's invisible. And George was swept into office in not swept, but he won the mayoralty in 1976 with the backing of gays, of neighborhood organizations, with a new force in city politics that was spearheaded by the Burton brothers and Willie Brown and their Democratic machine. George Moscone was part and parcel of that. Harvey Milk's background was very, very different. Harvey came from New York. He was a smart New York Jew, liked to crack wise, and he had a background in finance and the theater. He had been in the Navy. He had played football in high school. But eventually, he became the Rosa Parks of the gay movement. He was the fellow who stood up and went to the front of the bus and said, I'm going to be a city supervisor. I'm gay, and I'm going to be elected. And of course, he was, which was quite an extraordinary thing, especially because at that time in the city, in the mid-'70s, San Francisco was undergoing an integration crisis. Maybe the only gay integration crisis in history, but it certainly was an integration crisis. It was, as far as I can tell, the first time in human history that large numbers of homosexual people openly lived in one neighborhood, made it their neighborhood, and demanded their full rights and protections of the law. And it was an historic moment, and it did cause a great deal of consternation. The rest of San Francisco, whether of goodwill or ill, simply didn't know how to cope very easily with this new phenomenon. And so there was an enormous amount of tension in the city. And there was also an enormous amount of tension over George Moscone as becoming mayor because of his coalition, because of the way he had routed the more traditional city hall forces, and also because of the way he lived.